Hello. Today something more amusing. I think it is actually. It's part of the incredible journey of teaching is that you work with students who inevitably have their own intuition in music. If not, they wouldn't be studying in the first place. And the reason I mention this is because I like to think that a misread note, when they prepare a piece for a lesson, is not careless. It's very often an intuition of theirs that was in fact tricked by the composer's own unguessable, perhaps, intuition. And very often the publishers, using different ways to indicate the alterations on the notes, when there is some that could be hinted by the intuition, then they need to put what they like to call a courtesy accidental, just to make sure. Well, perhaps too many courtesy accidentals inevitably would clog the score and make it unreadable or undigestible. But to be honest, I find so exciting to see how many musicians, young ones who prepare a same piece that of course their predecessor did for centuries. I think that in my own span of over 4 decades of teaching, as many teachers I'm sure can agree with me, there are those misreadings that are almost like a trap by the composer or the publisher combined, depending of the notation display on the score. But I like to call them misguessings by the students. First of all, it's less judgmental. And why? Because I think that a musician who plays a piece is because they love that piece, or because they're told to learn this piece because it's supposed to represent the repertoire milestone they're supposed to reach in order to progress. That's what you do with students. And so of course they're more aware, less aware of the musical language of a given composer. And then they become more familiar by doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sonatas by Beethoven, and then if they do 1 or 2 by Scriabin, of course the time they get immersed in the musical language of these composers, by the time they get to be aware by their attuned musical ear with their intellectual learning of the notes of music by Albéniz or by Shostakovich or by Mettner, or Franck, they enter in musical idioms, and if they only know one piece of Fauré, they don't guess well, but if they know several, they find little by little the answer to the how much modal, how much tonal. What I think mostly is amazingly touching is that when I realized that they misread the note, and my teacher colleagues can agree with me that we all realize that they mostly fall in the same traps, to which we fell ourselves perhaps sometimes. To be absolutely honest, I don't want to appear at all pontificating, but the fact is that then I try to be very cautious, because I know that the first will be denial, come on, and then, oh my God, I didn't see it. Or I watched the bar, I played repetitively, but I saw what in fact I think they heard in their inner ear. That's what I say, the misguess rather than the misread. And of course a harmonic awareness helps a lot. If you don't have a harmonic awareness of the grammar of the movement of the chords, the modulations, the chromaticisms, the anticipations of a note that can become eventually inharmonically different spelled, but also therefore in different function. Okay, some pianists prefer the finger memory than the harmonic progression memory, because in real time it might be complex. They could do it on the paper by table and all that separately, but in the action of playing, not always. Fine. So what is interesting is that when they're aware that that's not what they're supposed to be playing, that note, Then is the famous sentence in the second or third tier of reaction, but I liked it better my way. Which is so true, because you spend weeks or whatever to prepare for the lesson, this new piece, and when you present it, you realize that you've practiced it thinking is right, sounding correct, perhaps it sounded legitimate, most likely actually, to your ear, and then all of a sudden you're denied your intuition. I don't want to twist too much the things about misread, misguessed, but still it has to be very delicately, I think, psychologically dealt with pedagogically. That's what I believe very much in. By saying, you know, after all, it sounded right because in another situation, this composer could have used this alteration this way that you guessed, but it happens to be that it's not. And so it's not like it's wrong. Of course, it is not right by essence. It's plausible. It could have been. It's just not. And so I can say, you know, you have the right intuition, but the composer chooses always or almost always to surprise us by the way they think the music is not always predictable. The circle of fifths, the sequence of this, the cadence of that. There is always a moment where they surprise us. And what does it mean they surprise us? They go against the intuition that we would follow with them. Of course, we don't all reach the level of their thinking in order to be surprised. Sometimes we just read the notes and recite them. That is too basic. At some point of repeating in order to learn, practicing in order to memorize, organizing the thoughts for the gestures of the fingers on the keyboard by the muscular memory. Basically, we input information in our brain cells through the fingers repetitively, by sections, by bars, by hand, and then together with rhythms or with patterns, with repeated notes, or until basically we sort of record it. The informations that we receive, record it in our brain, and then see how much of it remains in place after you've learned the piece. Sometimes students say, I knew that piece so well, but a month ago for the exam, and now I don't remember a note. And some others remember here or there specific sections, but then they have gaps in between the sections, bridges, transitions, modulations. So we have all a way to connect to the music that is obviously very personal. Of course, we have the factual objectivity of the score, the notes, the rhythms, the patterns, the articulations, the phrasings, the indications, the tempo, the mood, the pedaling, the phrasing, the idea of the subtlety of the inner voices, the outer voices, how to manage to bring the texture to a legibility by the listener while you do that analytically by saying, I want to bring out this, I want to bring out there. There is a secondary voice that's very important here, but I still maintain my melody or my melodic bass. A lot of things happen in different types of textures. And the idea is that when you know the piece well after the first learning, is that little by little the muscular memory taking over a lot of the operations on the daily base of the sections, your brain like a conductor can think constantly one bar, one beat perhaps, but then later perhaps even one bar ahead. And being always thinking ahead allows you to always react not but anticipate. And this way you shift faster than the tempo. You touch the note of a distant place and then you shape it as you want it, not just to be hopefully the right one upon landing, but touching before you play, which allows you then to organize your sculpting of the keyboard, as I like to call it. And the reason for that is that you have to count like a conductor in your head while you play, independently of the playing, so that when you shift earlier, you don't play right away, but you touch the key and then you shape it and you play it when its time has come rhythmically. In this way, you feel like you demultiply your hands. Very often, Chopin has two hands for the left hand, a bass line and a chord. And then the right hand plays the melody with decorations and all kind of beautiful emotional elements. So you cannot have three hands to play it. You should, ideally, be able to find how to divide in order to organize and display all these rich tones, modes, rhythms, pulses. Well, and then comes the beginning of my meeting with you today about the misguessed, misread notes. Some of them are more about not realizing the incongruity of the situation where a composer, for instance, didn't write a first and a second ending for a repeat and a continuation. And harmonically, it makes no sense. But you know, the truth be said, I think that we have to be always, of course, vigilant as teachers to make sure that we respect the student by teaching them the right notes. They're not supposed to misread, misguess, misplay, misknow. No, of course. It's about bringing them to feel like they were in fact creative. And I think that pedagogical aspect I developed personally, I find very important, because it gives the student a self-confidence instead of the opposite. Because if you tell the student, how come you misread this note, they'll feel really in inferiority, and that's not the purpose. Make them feel guilty for not reading it right, I don't think helps a lot, or even at all. I find that it's better to say, you know, it could have been that. It just happened not to be that. Therefore, of course, it's wrong. But you are not wrong to guess it so, because first it sounded right to you until the lesson when I reveal it to you because I happened to be the teacher the day you play the piece. But beyond that, I am also there to help them shape a hearing understanding stylistically, ethically about what they do. Of course, they have to do ethically what's right, what is in the score, that's objective. What the composer wanted with the publisher. And then we can research and find manuscript photocopies to double check, organize, see how through the different publishers through time there could be discrepancies, misreadings, misunderstandings by the publishers themselves. Could be a copyist mistake in the 19th century. Could be the composer themselves copying their piece, not realizing that there is a missing something. Or that they didn't think that they have to clear up with an accidental and natural because it was so intuitively right that they didn't even think it's possible not to be. So they look without to see. They hear without to watch, because they see but they don't hear what they see, since they know what they want. Of course, at this point it's a very difficult thing for a composer to proofread his or her own score. You need somebody who doesn't know the piece to sight read it objectively, and then realize where their fingers are going into. And if they go to a wrong note, you realize, oh, they guessed it, or did I, as a composer, if it's my case, misspell it. And very often, if I look at it, it might not even think wrong, because I know what is right since I composed it. But sometimes it's like a blinding by intuition. I don't know if that makes sense, but I believe that is very true. And that's why I'm so respectful and careful and attentive to not guilt up the student who misread a note. And then I give options, solutions, understandings, especially for first or second endings, or for some controversial situations of chromaticisms, or some misunderstood harmonic progressions, as it is. I know it's kind of a lot of little different ways of approaching the detailed importance of every note. Of course, you respect yourself, you respect your student, you respect the text, we respect the piece. We want to play it right, correct, according to what we think is the authenticity of each note. Phrase, articulation, mood, and all that, of course, but the note. the great line, the phrasing, how you organize those things. And when you study harmony in terms of voice leading, and you see that Beethoven rises a seventh when it's not supposed to be, you start thinking why and when, and you look at the manuscript and you realize how it happened. When you play a Rachmaninoff 39-5 piece in E flat minor, and everybody plays a minor seventh first inversion when in fact it's a German sixth. But it's not intuitive, and it is a question of obviously adding a little bit courtesy, accidental, to clear it up. If you play the third ballade by Chopin, and you play the famous section with the left hand's arpeggios that have so many ledger lines because they're in the half upper middle of the keyboard, and they didn't publish it with a treble clef at that time. It was always bass clef, no matter how high the left hand plays, at least in the publisher's idea. That was Belayev's opinion as publisher of Scriabin, who also writes left hands crossing inside the right hand, but in bass clef. So you have this ancient style TV antennas with the ledger lines going all the way up, and at some point it's unreadable beyond 3 ledger lines, or it is obviously, but it is misguessable, let's put it this way. And that happens in the fourth ballade also with the famous, I think, convinced that I am, but perhaps I'm wrong, and the day I would learn the truth I'll realize that I was wrong, but who knows if I ever learn it, is that that G flat had to have been tied as a half diminished seventh. It cannot be an E flat. It shouldn't be an E flat. And even if it was the purpose of the composer surprising us for our intuition, that perhaps guesses it instead of them, I still think that there are some sections where you think, well, he's never done it anywhere else. Specifically the ending of the B flat minor sonata's exposition in the first movement, returning into the first theme with a flat 7 in modal up 1 from 7 to first degree. He never does that. Never, just never. So why once? Perhaps it was just forgotten to mention natural when they tie the long A flat whole note in the left hand, and it was not tied in the left hand while yes in the right hand. So it could be that Chopin was so, it was so evident, self-evident for him that people cannot go back to the B flat minor opening without the leading tone. They cannot go flat 7-1, that they'll figure it out. Perhaps he just read it without seeing it because it was so obvious. When we know leading tones 99% of the time go to the tonic. Also another example is the Danse Allemande in the Carnival by Schumann, which is on the Alpha and Omega of Paganini inside as a B section. There is a evident for me wrong first ending unindicated with a D flat of the subdominant, no actually in this case it's a dominant 7th, forgive me, and that has to go back to the opening, and then when you continue on the dominant chord it's a triad, it's not a dominant 7th. And so you wonder, all these things, do they matter? I could be the devil's advocate to myself. Yes, I believe that these specific notes should be made sure they're played correctly, read correctly, implemented correctly, and once you realize that they are correct, you have to play them with the same conviction that your intuition as a student brought you to play it with the wrong note according to the reality of the truth, because after all, there is an objective fact. Regardless of these guessings and these intuitions and this composer's inability to see the reality so much their conviction sees, they're blinded by their intuition. Okay, but there is a fact that those notes have to be, I think, suggested to the student clearly, and then not making the student feel guilty, because that's, I think, not productive. And then feel the student that they are, in fact, in the musical immersion of the language of the composer, and therefore, that's marvelous. There you go, the Valse Allemande of Schumann's Carnival. The D flat flat of the dominant seventh returns to the first opening after the repeat. And then he doesn't have a second ending, so here he does that dominant seventh D flat, but then he starts in the continuation with a triad of the dominant note. So what is the difference is that when you do the first ending, middle voice returns to the tonic, and the second time you stay without the D flat, because the D flat is a passing tone dominant seventh from the E flat to the C. In the second ending it should be just and then in the fourth ballade by Chopin, you have the dominant minor ninth suspension, and then they give you this. They, the publishers. So perhaps it was really Chopin who wanted that, and that would be incredibly good because he goes in the melody to the G flat of the half diminished seventh. But on the downbeat it's E flat, but not in the sequence a few bars before. Did he have to do it because of the sequence? Did he have to do it differently because of a serendipitous copy's mistake? Is my opinion. The G flat has to be tied. It was not tied, and then they put an E flat because it's just the note written one line under the G flat in treble clef. For me, it's so self-evident that it's impossible to accept that little discrepancy of the guessing. But who knows, perhaps that is the case. I remain very humble, and if I know that it is really what he wanted, of course we can assume that is what he wanted because all the publishers do this or that, and so they tell us. But you know, even that evolves. From one publisher to another, we have new revelations, new musicologists, innuendo, detail searching. In the third ballade, the famous mistake that everybody knows when they teach, the misreading, is always played. See, it sounds exactly legit, except it's not, because it's one extra ledger line. Instead of being G A flat, in fact, is B flat C flat, which goes to the melodically on the downbeat of the next bar to this dominant seventh. That is typical misguessing of a student mistake, because misreading, because not used to read so many ledger lines on the F clef above, and because it's so many times in the piece before this happens, it only has the G A flat. So after that, hear it another last time, or you read it the last time, you assume, but and you have to be very cautious, as I said earlier, careful, say, you know, it's really good, it's right, but wrong. Misguessed, but rightly, intuitively, well guessed, but wrong, because he didn't do that. And then you bring them to the melodic line, voice leading. For the Chopin's opening exposition of the second sonata, he starts with that type of striking attention calling wrong harmony that has nothing to do with the piece in B flat minor. When you hear a C sharp minor first inversion, inharmonically, the C sharp becoming D flat is the appoggiatura to the dominant C, and then you start B flat, of course. and then you have the theme. And at the end of the exposition, you have the arrival in D flat major, relative major. And then what? If you want to return, you cannot do, at least I think, Chopin never did flat 7-1. So you could do this, and then see that there is no second tie of the two whole notes. And that's most likely what was suggested by Chopin, but not implemented by the clearing of the accidental, by adding actually a natural sign. And that sounds a bit artificial. So you could also consider, many pianists say, in absence of a second ending and a first ending, then you could go back to the introduction, even if harmonically it makes no sense to return to D flat minor in harmonic just for a beat. And because of situations like in Beethoven 111, you always restart at the theme, not at the introduction. I mean, in many cases when you have an introduction, you don't restart from the introduction. That's the whole purpose in the sonata form. You start from the first theme, the double bar. And so in this case, you can do, and then just a tiny, very common bridge that Chopin uses in so many pieces, and that I suggest tiny bit creatively. Of course, it's not in the score, but it's an innuendo bridge, I find. Perhaps I'm wrong. Most likely, I'm outside of the gospel of the urtext scores. I mean, of course, it's important, essential to understand the purpose of the meaning, the innuendo, the storytelling, the imagination of what the composer said, expressed, implemented, intended through these notes, what kind of psychological emotion, what kind of pleasantry, what kind of depth of reflection it carries with to us to bring to the audience, to ourselves, because we are the recipients of the score and we are the transmitters to the audience. If not, they can read the book without the need a person to read it to them, if they can read the notes. But because we are storytellers through their music, and they trust us, the audience, that we do the right thing, we have to be very careful. It's no more the time of Busoni, who transfigurates Bach's Chaconne, and people today would consider it ludicrous, especially the ones who think rightfully that we have to be authentically driven for everything. The authenticity matters, what was intended. And in these cases that I give you the examples, there is a problem, because there are little doubts about the notation totally misleading, or the notation completely locking us out from an intuitive connection. It's very subtle, I agree. It's not, so to say, clear or wrong, right or wrong, or clear or dark. I think in a gray area you have to follow your instinct, your musical intelligence. You're not arrogantly trying to rewrite it or play it instead of what the composer thought, but to follow your instinct educatedly with the ideas that you have from other pieces, understanding the whole musical language of the composer. I mean, art historians do that when they analyze a copy from an original, even if it's completely sometimes baffling. They know how to find out. They know how to examine it. And of course, at the naked eye, it's not obvious. And at the naked ear, sometimes either, obviously, if I may say so. And I find that very interesting. When you go to the Rachmaninoff 39.5, That's the German 6 in Rachmaninoff. The augmented 6 G flat E natural, and not because composers should think about this, and the publishers especially, to make sure they put the courtesy accidental and not the E flat, which is so often misread. Was it misread, misguessed, misunderstood? Or I don't think it's to do with carelessness. I think in this complete avalanche of notes and harmonies and chromaticisms and alterations and this intensity of the pounding chords. Of course, if you studied harmony, you realize that it has to be an augmented 6, which we call German in America. And I find that it doesn't belittle at all, in my personal opinion as a teacher or sometimes a jury judge, that if a student or a candidate or a competitor does this misreading for some reason, escaping his early or her earlier learning, and just happen to carry it through, I personally, that's a personal ethics, I don't consider that this should be held against the young person. I mean, it happens to all of us to misguess notes, if we are all honest. And we have done it sometimes, and we regret it because we feel like we are dumb to have done it. And nobody feels happy or proud or comfortable with it. So it's a very delicate matter, in fact. It's not light-hearted at all to make fun of. Or it's easier to make fun of others than of oneself, but I am very honest and humble, and I honestly say that I don't think that these misreadings, however often heard around, and I'm sure all the teachers, as I said earlier, would agree with me, they don't determine really the quality of the presentation of the piece. I think it's just singularities that have to be, or peculiarities rather, of the musical language of the composer that have to be brought to understand. There's something interesting about the end of 109 in the first movement. It always bothered me, since I've done a lot of, like many students do, 4 parts harmony. How come he goes 5 of 5, 2 dominants in a row, and then 5 and 1 obviously in E major? Why his dominant in the left hand rises when the dominant drops? Tension release. And then I looked at the photocopy of the manuscript. Originally, he just did the 2 chords. Then he added a suspension. Do, si, do, si. And then the subdominant A was in the thumb, the leading tone D sharp in the second finger, the second degree F sharp in the third finger, and the suspension C sharp in the right top 5th finger of the right hand, obviously, of the same hand, meaning. Obviously is too large because it's a 10th between A and C sharp plus the D sharp, F sharp inside. So then he allocated, and you can see it in the thicker ink marking, the A in the left hand because it was too large to hold with the suspension. So for a beautification of the melody by delaying resolution, he was obliged to delegate the subdominant to the left hand. But it wasn't part of the chord because you don't go to the G sharp in the resolution. Of of course, he doesn't write a harmony exercise. He doesn't have to obey the rules of the melodic motions of the voice leading. Do we do it only because it's a theory exam or example or a lesson or assignment? Or we then break the rule when we do our creativity? Most likely. And that is something that Mademoiselle Boulanger taught me when I was a child. The difference between the forbidden in the harmony book for parallel fifths, octaves, dubbing, leading tone. Oh my God, dubbing, leading tone. Of course, because of parallel octaves. But the parallelism is not wrong. It's just undesired, because if you avoid it, then you become creative in your voice leading of the inner voices. Composers are creative, and we play the composers, and sometimes our own misguessing creativity brings this spice. The misguessing, the misreading, the wrong note, it's not a curse, and it shouldn't be a guilt, and I think it should be explained, it should be put in context, it shouldn't be overly dealt with. Of course, is the topic of my talk to you today, but I still think that it's a wonderful thing to teach. Not just the wrong from the right, from the score, just because the score is there between the student and us for the authenticity. Okay, we can have our opinions, our own humility, because as I said, I personally have misread many notes and then discovered it later, and sometimes even revealed by a student's reading of a piece that I thought it's a student's wrong note, but I looking at the score, I realize I misguessed it. So this is very important. Of course, teachers will hardly accept to mention it to their students, but I find that, okay, there is a hierarchy. There is the knowing and the knowledge, and then the students who are acquiring it, and there is a asymmetrical relation about the knowledge between the student and the teacher. I totally accept, agree. Of course, both the student and the teacher are asymmetrically placed in front of the composer's thought process, and how that organizes itself, and how we want to bring it according to not the distant, definitive little note or important note, or every note is important, but into the matter of the phrasing, the articulation, the expression, the tempo, the mood, the meaning, the why of the what, and how you bring it alive from the dead scroll of the page, if I may say so. But it is fact that not everything is indicated, even if sometimes by the publisher it can be misguiding if there is no an extra, let's say, little accidental, just to remind you not to go into the wrong note if your intuition guides you to the courtesy accidental. But anyway, I find it very humbling and very enthusing to teach, because you're constantly in contact with the new discovery by this young budding artist of what you already discovered. And they discover it, and they make you rediscover it in ways that you didn't think about it. It doesn't have to be drastic for the whole structure, or even if it is for a specific note. It is just a way of retelling the tale, restating the story. It makes you very humble, because you realize that after you, many will come. Before you, many wondered how to express the same musical sentence, and then you have fashions and schools of thought, and you have awareness today more than before because of the recordings and the availability of the variety of interpretations. And so you end up by easily possibly getting lost in all this thinking. I mean, come on, not everybody reads the same, understands the same, translates the same from the score. And I think that possibly that helps, because before, in my generation, is whatever the teacher said for the tempo, the phrasing, the articulation, and everything. It was an aesthetic guide. It was a stylistic guide. It was really art music guide for our interpretation. Of course, we changed mind very often, but why? Perhaps not in front of the teacher. And today, very often, students come by saying, I heard Rubinstein do so, Horowitz do so, because I can see it. And you're in a comparative at that point, and you have to justify as a teacher the why it should be this way. You think because that's what the composer really wanted, and you have to find an analytical, objective explanation that is to do with the rationale. But sometimes there is no rationale. It's just the composer's intuition or misguided intuition of ours to imagine that he should do what we guess, or what is supposed to be according to the harmonic progression that we studied in school. No, I think that that's the beauty of it, is that we are confronted constantly to understand what we guess, to guess what we analyze, and then go back to the intuition, in the sense that when we say it in music, it has to appear like we just say it by ourselves with conviction, not just a recitation of somebody else's text that we more or less misunderstand, and hopefully with time more than less. And that we have comparisons of interpretations gives us perhaps a confusion in the beginning, if I would be a young student today, of the variety of existing readings or legibilities of the piece's interpretation. And you can always say, oh, I like this, I hate that, I like this and I hate that. Of course, that's what you're supposed to do as a student, because you create your own value system. You become educated, cultivated. Your imagination, it's not hopefully stifled by the fact that not everything is possible, but you can retell it according to what means to you once you have studied, analyzed, compared, and detailed, and then you just tell the story, and the audience has to believe in the moment, like for an actor, that you are the piece. If more than the composer's piece, you are the piece itself. The piece is the translation of the humanity that comes through this composer, and that is offered to us. It's a vision of the world, a vision of death, a vision philosophically of life, of meaning, of love, of expectation, of anticipation, of drive, of hunger, of appetite, of modulation, of chromaticisms, of through the musical grammar. They express themselves, their own humanity. That's what I believe is so touching, that we rediscover through the students' readings as teachers. How marvelous, how humbling, and how enthusing.